Good morning. Welcome to our technical webinar, How 2020 Changed VDI. Thank you for spending part of your morning with us. We have a great session planned for you. Our speakers today are Christian Chavez and Chuck Foley. Christian is a data center and cloud solutions architect at Aspire. He has over 15 years of consulting and implementation experience across various architectures. Chuck is a senior director at NetApp. He is a seasoned high-tech executive with a strong background in enterprise computing, storage networking, and software. Okay, I will now turn things over to Christian. Christian.
A little bit about Aspire that I want to let everybody know. So Aspire is a solutions delivery and managed services provider. And our focus is on digital infrastructure, where we're actually leveraging consultative approach to actually build infrastructure to meet your business goals, right? So our engineering process isn't based on single product lines. We're focused on cross architectures and building infrastructure to support your applications and your intellectual property. And in order to do that, we need to build an ecosystem around us. So we leverage partners like Cisco and NetApp to bring that best of breed solutions into your data center. That's what Aspire does. So we'll just get right into it. Welcome everybody again. This is the second webinar in the VDI series. Previously, we talked about the business aspect of it and how did we get to where we are today with VDI and sort of what pushed VDI into what we call to the enterprise scale, right? And how has it evolved? So today we're actually going to get into some more of the technical components that are meant to build the VDI because we've now evolved into a much more enterprise solution. And then we'll just talk about how we've gotten to that enterprise solution leveraging some of the components that we'll talk about today. So the first thing that we actually want to bring to top of mind is the infrastructure, right? So the underlying infrastructure that supports VDI is the crucial piece. And previously I had said that when we were doing VDI before, right, we were starting to do POCs, POVs. Businesses were actually starting to dip their foot into VDI. Fast forward 2020, it sort of propelled that initiative, right? Because people now needed to actually go remote. But in speaking of the infrastructure, there were things that we were learning as we were building out these proof of concepts, proof of values. And that was a lot of things that were going on inside of the infrastructure that we were trying to either get around. So inside the infrastructures, there were a lot of issues that we were running into. Typically, I mean, first and foremost were the boot storms, right? So as we were starting to grow the user base, the boot storm that actually happened on the disk, it was just crazy, right? It would just start hammering the disks. So we needed to actually upgrade disks. We were doing that by adding a lot more disks, right? So we added more disks to get the IOPS that were necessary to circumvent those boot storms that were happening. The other thing that was happening is, as part of that growth, right, was the desktop patching. So the more users we had, the more that we had to do in terms of patching all those systems and how do we get to that, right? It became some type of user management. And then the other thing was how do we get fast deployments out of this? Because as the user counts increased, how do we get to that fast deployments? And ultimately, what was starting to suffer, or what we were seeing that was actually driving a lot of this infrastructure, was the user experience. So ultimately, that's what we're trying to get to, right? Is the user experience has to be as if they were sitting in front of a computer, right? So a lot of that drove a lot of the infrastructure that was under the VDI deployment. So Chuck, I know you've been part of this. We were on the engineering side. We were talking to clients and working through some of this thing. But I know NetApp was instrumental in helping us actually get a lot of that infrastructure in place. What was NetApp doing in terms of infrastructure to be able to support VDI at that time?
Its level of prominence in the organization. VDI used to be kind of a tier 2, tier 3 application that now, when you have not only hundreds but thousands of users hitting your VDI environment post 2020, you've got, as you noted, a much higher level of infrastructure requirement. And what we're finding is that with end user compute workloads in the cloud, it starts right at the bottom with storage. And so what we did is we looked at the VDI workload and said, what's going on there and how can we apply some advanced storage technologies specifically to those problems? You mentioned boot storms. Boot storms is a read-heavy activity that occurs when you got lots of people signing on at the same time. Think of you got 1,000 people signing on between 8 and 8:30 a.m. Eastern time if you're an East Coast based company. But then you also have login storms. So even if you're already booted up and you go to lunch or you have breaks in the middle of the day, you might have, especially with shift workers, you might have a large number of people logging back in. The machines are booted up, but they're logging, and that's a write-heavy activity. They'll use two different types of storage resource, and that, by the way, you've got AV storms, antivirus storms, which is really read intensive and ties up lots of resources at one time. That's the kind of bad weather that you face as a VDI administrator, those kind of storms.
Yeah.
So what we did was we took the kind of technology that we use in the enterprise and applied it to this. A great example is how we've taken the ONTAP operating system, which it's powering some of the most demanding users around the globe in their data centers. We actually lifted it up into the cloud. An example for VDI is Azure NetApp Files, which is an implementation of ONTAP running in Azure, which is often used for Microsoft's high-scale WVD or Windows Virtual Desktop environments. By applying the ONTAP operating system in the form of ANF to this particular workload, we're able to kind of crush those boot storms and login storms that not only do they hurt performance, but they can kill entire projects as users say, forget it, I can't use this anymore. I'll give you one example. There is a Western university or university in the Western US that is using VDI as a way to educate not only their computer science, but a lot of their education departments. And they have maybe between 1,000 and 1,500 VDI users. But since it's being used largely for educational purposes, think about it. It's a college. A class starts at 9 a.m. Everybody signs on. But then they leave at 9:50, 9:55, and another class signs on at 10. What they found is using standard commodity storage infrastructure, they were getting boot storms and subsequent login storms that were taking 10 minutes for all the students to get on, because all these, it's not just the 50 people in this class. Around the campus, everybody signs on at 9 and at 10 and on 11. And so they were losing maybe 10 minutes out of a 50-minute class time to the machines coming up and running. That's really tough. And so by deploying Azure NetApp Files, they were able to get rid of those storms and literally buy back 10 to 20% of their educational time. There is a proof point that we did with Microsoft. And what we did is we took a 500 user profile group and did a reference architecture. We set up the infrastructure in Azure using Windows 10 version 19. We used ANF for the storage of both user profiles and user data. And we used a tool called Login VSI, which is a really well-renowned tool in this industry to look at VDI behavior. And what we found is with 500 continuous users, and not only continuous, but people constantly signing on and signing off, so stressing that extra work on the infrastructure workload, we were able to have constant, consistent performance. At peak I/O was about 3,000 IOPS, which is a lot for that workload. An average steady state of about 1,700 IOPS or IOs per second, and have 0 failed sessions, 0 disconnects, and consistent sub-millisecond latency. That's the key, sub-millisecond latency. And this is with one user signing on about every 5.5 to 6 seconds, trying to add that extra stress, and a consistent throughput on that of 80 megs per second peak and 55 megs per second on average without bottlenecks. That's the kind of infrastructure. If you're doing 30 users, you might not need that.
Right.
Once you get above about 100 users in a given VDI workspace or WVD workspace, you really need to consider, all right, I'm now kind of entering that realm where boot storms with read intensive activity, login storms with write intensive activity, and AV storms at periods of the day are going to really hit me. I got to pay attention to that.
Yeah, for sure. So there's some key things in there that you had pointed out that I kind of want to reiterate again. And one, right, all the users that we were now dealing with, or you were seeing, right, it was based on workload size. So you had mentioned tier 1, tier 3, right? So originally it was the light users, people were just using basic apps on top of their desktops. Now we have users that need GPUs. They're a lot more heavier, which then sort of just increase that boot storm that you were talking about, and
right.
not only just a boot storm, but also the resources necessary. One of the key things, though, that you were talking about, right? You talked about Azure and cloud is prevalent nowadays. And as you're growing your user base, you're looking for resources, ways of being able to expand your infrastructure. So mobility was key, right? Especially in 2020. 2020 kind of, everybody started working remote. So the mobility aspect of it, right, really came into play. So we started moving things out to cloud or maybe other infrastructure. And then that also kind of built out a new headache, I guess, if you would say, is the security aspect. How do you secure these people that are now remote, right? Then they're coming into your infrastructure, pulling desktops, things like that. So a lot of these things actually moved. So the concept back then, right, or previous, right, was pods. I remember the days we were building pods for a certain amount of users, and we kind of expanded that. So now the pod is extended out to the cloud, right? And these things kind of drove that. So moving from just traditional infrastructure, right? So now we've now built distributed VDI environments, right? So a lot of things that we needed to take into account as we were moving things out, right? I know NetApp's been on top of this. We've always had conversations around this, and you've helped a lot of this actually come to fruition. But distributed environments is huge, right? And there's a lot of things that need to happen because your remote workers now are in separate locations, and they could be, distributed across either the U.S. or maybe other continents, depending on how your business is laid out. But I know NetApp has taken care of this, right? Can you talk about what NetApp is doing in this area?
Yeah, so you actually threw a few things in there, right? Mobility and security and managing a distributed workspace. So I will tell you that
A little bit of everything.
What the heck? I'll hit a couple of the points, may not everything. I will say that when we're working with larger enterprises around the globe, security has become one of their primary reasons to escalate their VDI deployments, and actually to escalate it to a cloud-based VDI deployment. And if you think about it, VDI is a much more secure environment than a desktop or laptop environment. You don't have a unit walking around with your company's applications and data on it that could get stolen or destroyed or hacked. Everything, all of that desktop infrastructure is up in the cloud, and which means it's protected and secured by multiple layers, both yours with your Active Directory as well as the cloud providers. It's just a much more secure environment. Even now, you have secure access to that without even requiring VPN. Without getting too technical, it's basically a callback type methodology that's used as an example by Azure WVD, that you connect and ask for VDI session, and it will literally call your machine back, call a known machine back. So it's very difficult to spoof or hack, et cetera. It's just one more step in the secure equation, and that has become really preeminent with a lot of our customers. In addition to that, when you mention the global environment, you now have to say, all right, I have VDI workspaces potentially everywhere. That's a new thing. If you look back a couple of years, if a company had a VDI environment, they likely had it in their data center. Most companies didn't have data centers around the world. They had one or two, right? And so I don't care where you were in the world. If you were a VDI user, you're coming into Dallas or Boston or New York or whatever your data center was. The cloud changes that. You now have the ability to put VDI resources closer to the users, and that's what most people want. I consistently hear from end user compute directors and VDI admins that they want to keep the virtual desktops within a 30 millisecond round trip of the user. So that doesn't mean I got to live in the same city. If I'm in Manchester in the UK, I can use a hyperscaler environment that's in London. If I'm in Munich, I can use Google in Frankfurt. It doesn't have to be right next to me. But that's way different than coming 300 milliseconds for every activity on a data center in the US. So moving to the cloud allows that. That means you've got to manage that environment, and we have a tool for that. It's a global control plane called Virtual Desktop Service, because what we found is managing multiple environments it's one of those situations that if every time I have to do the same task, I introduce not only more time and effort, but more risk of error and breach. So if I could have one place to sit and one screen, and I can deploy a new application set, or I can update my images, or I can apply a new Active Directory GPO or security policy, and I can do that one time, and it goes to Azure in the UK and Google in Asia and AWS in the US and even my own on-prem stuff. That's really important. So that global control plane concept has become very important in the VDI world, and it's really raising up in level of importance, and I recommend people look into that. The other thing is, as you show here on the screen, when you end up with multiple VDI workspaces, you end up, and people do that for all the right reasons, but you end up with the requirement to build out the storage infrastructure under each workspace. That means, all right, I have storage infrastructure not only for my session hosts and my users, but my shared storage and my infrastructure storage. I got to do that potentially in Europe. I got to do it at one or more places in the US. I got to do it in APAC. I got to do it in Latin or South America. And it becomes a lot of extra work, because every time you build out that infrastructure, you got to worry about backup, recovery, DR, audit, compliance, security. One of the technology that we apply to this problem is a technology we have that you note on the screen called Global File Cache. Global File Cache allows multiple distributed workspaces from around the world to use a single instance of shared storage. So maybe that's Azure NetApp files running in US East. And what Global File Cache does is it's a small software footprint that will sit in each workspace around the world. So Frankfurt, Singapore, Brazil, London, and it caches locally any data that is often used by that user population, as well as it has the metadata for the entire shared store. So if I'm in London, maybe I don't want to build out 100 terabytes of infrastructure in London. Maybe my users there only have a 2 terabyte active working set. So in London, it'll have the metadata for all 100 terabytes that's sitting in US East, but it only has actually 2 terabytes of the most often used data. And that way, anything that they most often use is immediately there. Anything that is not often used is brought across using protocol optimization. So it's much faster than going over the network, not quite as fast as if it was actually locally staged in London. And what we find is we get about an 80% locality of reference. If we look across our user base, about 80% of the time, a given user population, the London user group or the Frankfurt group or whatever, is using data that they have used before. And by applying these technologies of caching and optimization to the distributed VDI equation, we let you have one single place to manage the data for the entire global user footprint. That means one place to do backup, one place to do audit and compliance, one place to do DR. And you do that once, but everybody can take advantage of it. It really reduces your cost and complexity in having a global VDI setup.
Excellent. No, I definitely agree. But, there's things. When I have conversations with clients, I always say that, sometimes when we're providing a solution, sometimes that creates some issues in other areas, right? There's always a reaction to what you're doing. And so in thinking of when you're deploying VDI, right, these are the methods that we kind of take. And one of them is management, right? So you have, you have your, some on-prem VDI, let's just say, or maybe some desktops. You're using some global file cache, it's distributed. So you have all these things that are going on in your environment. But now the management aspect, right, becomes the next go-to, right? How are we going to manage all this? And so one of them, as you see here, is the deployment aspect, right? How do we deploy these in a fashion where we can get it out to users much faster, or maybe move resources as it's needed? How do we do that?
Yeah, I kind of say it, but I hate to say it, but I kind of feel sorry for a lot of those end user compute guys out there, because as VDI becomes the norm, these people that have heretofore have been experts in Windows and x86 now have to become experts in not only Windows and x86, but VDI technologies and cloud technologies and new types of interlock between Active Directories. It's becoming a much tougher job than it was before. You mentioned the deployment task. To simply set up a VDI environment, there is, because we've profiled and modeled this with a lot of our customers, there's about 38 tasks to do to set up, let's say, a 300 user VDI environment. That takes about 3 to 4 weeks between your information collection and prepping the infrastructure, your application prep, your scaling rules, your image management, your data migration, your security groups, your database server setup, your domain prep, and all that kind of stuff. That takes 3 weeks, maybe. In some cases more, depending on the complexity, especially of your user profiles and your app groups and what you're going to make available. You have to do things like, number one, you got to create the storage infrastructure, to provision it, create the volumes, assign the tiers, assign user profile storage from application storage. Then you got to set up the networking infrastructures with VPCs and subnets and interdependencies. And then comes the computing infrastructure, both the infrastructure VMs for gateways and brokers and things like that. But then you have to set up your host pools and your session servers and set policies for what size machine gets how many users. And once you got all that infrastructure, then you have to set up your Active Directory environment. If you don't have, and I'm using Azure as an example, if you don't have an Azure AD, you got to set up that and join that to your on-premise AD. And then you got to set up your app groups with all the applications of what's going to be used. I got to tell you, it's a lot. It's all for good reason, and it's the right thing to do. But it's a lot of work. And so one of the things that we've done is, I mentioned that virtual desktop service before, that global control plane, which is a service we're running. NetApp hosts the service. You can say, hey, VDS, I don't have 3 or 4 weeks to give to this. I need that thing up and running way faster than that. You can tap into VDS and you can have it use automation and machine logic to do that work for you. It'll slash your time by about 75%. So if it was going to take you 3 weeks before, it's going to take a few days now. And a lot of those days is you doing research and determining your policies, et cetera. I mean, if I've done all of my homework, we have created brand new 100 user WVD workspaces in 2 hours. Let's be honest though, the average, I'm a VDI admin, I have a job, I have to do all this work. You can cut it to a few days. And that's huge by compared to starting from scratch and taking it 3 to 4 weeks. All that is time that is invested back in the business. And that's just on the deployment side. That's day one or month one.
Right. But now we have user management, we have app management, right? So there's still a management aspect to that, right? So we've automated deployments, we've got this large scale VDI deployment, and managing user now, or app management in this case as well. How are you helping out in that realm?
That same tool, tool,
okay.
Plane, VDS will also take over that, and not take over that, but it will do that work for you. It's like having a bunch of little VDI admins living in the cloud that never sleep and never take vacation. Kind of like we did the profiling of what are the tasks to deploy VDI workspaces. We did the same profiling for said what buckets of time do I have to spend in managing that. It's about 2 to 3 man weeks per month for 200 to 300 users, and that's in terms of user support, application usage tracking, process management, user management, providing access and temp access, and resetting passwords, image management, which is a big one. So what we determined is the span of control for a single VDI admin, probably around 300 to 350 users in most environments. We can massively expand that, because if you're using this service, and you provided access to your cloud account, it will manage the infrastructure for you. It will do VM management and backups and storage management, storage cleanup and backups, your VM image management with any changes and edits that need to be made, session VM sizing, how many users per group. It'll also manage the Windows OS layer in terms of patches and updates and versions and anti-malware. You just tell it what to do one time, and it will do it everywhere for you. And if you think about it, if you have multiple VDI workspaces, that's super cool. You can say, this is the new version of a given application, or this is the new version of .NET, and here's the applications that are affected, and it'll do it in each of the 3 clouds and on-prem for you after you tell it to do it one time. And even from the Windows layer, go up to the application layer. So you can use tool sets to apply new versions, patches, updates. It takes into account those interdependencies. It'll allow you to say, I've got a user group, and I want to apply this GPO to these user group, or this other user profile type gets this resource, but this other one gets a smaller level resource. It'll do all that for you, and it will use automation for a lot of the common ongoing user support, session restart issues, and performance optimizations.
So that would be on the optimization, right? So in terms of optimization at the desktop level, it'll take a look at resource utilization and make adjustments based on that utilization?
Yeah, well, optimization is, you can apply optimization to 2 places. One is to performance optimization, and it does that ongoing. The other, however, and this one's really key, is cost optimization. A lot of people wake up after moving a workload like VDI to the cloud and realize, oh, wow, I'm paying a lot more every month than I thought it was. This happens a lot in the VDI world, because once you have a few thousand users and you give them access to a resource in the cloud, they spin it up and they go to lunch, or they take the rest of the day off. And that session is sitting there and ching, 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 costing
Yeah.
you pennies per hour. So what we found is we needed to build into this global control plane the ability to have it do cost optimization on those resources, both at the storage and the compute layer. So if you look at the compute layer, it will do things like give you a really good policy-based way to, across a global landscape, if users aren't interacting and using their session, it'll log them off. And that's pretty standard technology. But we take it even further with something we call live scaling that says, not only are we logging off users that are not interacting anymore with their system, they can log back on whenever they come back. But you usually, when you buy a VM, you're buying a session VM that's yay big. Maybe you're spending $200 a month for a certain size machine, and you've determined that fits 20 users on that VM. So if you got 20 users, it's one VM. If you got 200, it's 10 VMs. The problem is these users are dynamic. So you only want to spin up VMs as you need them because you're paying for them. You figure you're good up to 20. That's your service level agreement. But what happens, people find that as they go through the day, they find a lot of VMs with 2, 3, 4 users on them because everybody signed on, then a bunch of people signed off. And when 20 signed on this one, then you spun up another one for the next 20 and another for the next 20. And when these guys sign off, you got wasted space. So what VDS do is it'll apply live scaling to make sure that we're constantly taking steps to consolidate the right number of users to the smallest number of machines. If I have 20 users that signed on and et cetera, down the line with other VMs, as people sign off of the first one or are logged off, new users will go on to the machines that have closer to the maximum number. You don't want to put a new user on a machine with 3 users if in fact you have other machines that have 15 that can handle 20. You want to get to that 20 point. And that way you're using the smallest number of VMs for the most highest population of users. And then what you also want to do is you want to have automated logic that will deploy more resources during your peak times. We call it workload resource scheduling, so that during those boot storms and login storms, or times when you have certain types of user groups that might need GPU performance, you can have certain types of resources that are allocated according to your history. And that means that they don't have to wait or call and ask you for those resources to be provisioned. Those are the ways that we can optimize the cost, usually cutting it about in half. So we'll save about 50% on your IaaS, your cloud compute and storage infrastructure budget that way.
Got it. Okay. So the management aspect, right? We're now tasking the internal teams to sort of leverage all these tools, great tools, right? But there's something interesting that NetApp did. There was a report that came out, and I kind of wanted to touch on that, right? In terms of third party being able to help to run these solutions for clients of ours, right? Can you just real quickly speak about this report that came out?
Yeah, it's a great report. You can get at it through our website, and I also know that you guys at Aspire make it available as well. It's a report by Enterprise Strategies Group that was done in May of last year, so it's fairly current, that talks about as VDI becomes more widely deployed, especially as it employs the cloud paradigms, what is the experience that people are finding? And what they're finding is there is neither enough knowledge or manpower to satisfy, in most organizations, to satisfy the shift to VDI. 93% of enterprises, and this includes large enterprises with hundreds of people in their IT department, 93% have to go outside and bring in pay for services or contractors to help them set up and then on an ongoing basis run their VDI environments because they just don't have the knowledge in-house. Or maybe they do, but they got one guy and they need 4. And that's why we're doing 2 things. We're partnering with people like Aspire that have deep knowledge in this area, and we're arming our partners and our customers with this global control plane that can use automation and machine logic to do that work. So you need a fraction of the staff to do a lot of this infrastructure stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And last but not least, as we're closing out here, nobody can talk about some type of infrastructure without backup and compliance, right? Those are key at the end of the day. Sometimes overlooked, but now that we have this, this architecture, all these wonderful tools that we're using, what does NetApp bring to the table when it comes to backup and compliance?
Anybody that knows NetApp knows that ONTAP, which is our storage operating system, is the world's leading storage operating system. It's running in, as I said earlier, the most demanding data centers in the world, has been for almost 30 years. It's got integrated technology, our snapshot technology, that will allow you to keep either multiple sites in sync, have an automatic disaster recovery site, or use our snapshot technology as part of your backup. So you can have block level incremental forever backups that take a fraction of the time, give you an immediate RTO, RPO capability. And we've extended that not only from our on-prem systems, but to our cloud systems in a very unified fashion. Through NetApp Cloud Manager, you can set up, all right, I've got my infrastructure on-prem or in my different clouds running my VDI workloads. I want to point and click and have my backup done according to a particular policy. No software to install, no software to get trained on. It's a service. You literally go to the URL and turn it on. And that's kind of like ante to the game, right? Backup and restore. You mentioned another one, which is compliance, and that gets big. And that's something that we find a lot of people overlook now that as you're consolidating this end user compute workload, when you bring data from hundreds or thousands of laptops, it's no longer that individual guy sitting out in Germany or London. You've actually brought that data into a corporate environment. You have a higher responsibility assessed on that. And you need to start thinking of it like you would your Oracle and your SAP data.
Right.
So having the ability on these consolidated shares to do compliance, to do scans for PII or regulatory potential violations for GDPR, HIPAA, CPPA, et cetera, it's something that we've added to the equation as well. Once again, from our Cloud Manager storage control plane, you point to your ONTAP system or your cloud-based ONTAP system, and you say, that's an area where there might be this kind of data. Turn on cloud compliance. It's done as a service, no software for you to install, and it will assess your risk and produce reports and give you highlights and warning if somebody's doing something that's not particularly kosher. Finally, and this is probably the biggest thing I would add for this particular topic of end user compute, the number one area that we see people miss is, all right, I got all my users, they're consolidating their data here. What are you doing about their Microsoft 365 data? That's not something that sits on your storage resources where you do backup and recovery and DR.
Right.
Look, virtually everybody uses Microsoft 365, formerly known as Office 365. Everybody uses it. And Microsoft is an incredible company that gives you great resiliency in their infrastructure. But what that means is O365 or Microsoft 365 is there if you need it. What it doesn't mean is that your data is there, because Microsoft is very explicit in their license agreement. We're providing you access to the service, but the data is yours to take care of. You might have seen the scenario from last July where a KPMG sysadmin, big company, great company, smart guy, made a mistake, because people do that. People make mistakes, and blew away something like 5,000 Teams accounts from the last couple of years, gone forever.
That was brutal.
More recently, I just saw that there was an IT contractor who was actually put in jail for 2 years because he was let go by a company. They didn't like his work. He went in a back door and deleted their O365 accounts. They were the entire business was offline for 3 days, and it took them 3 months to rebuild their accounts from that, because they didn't know that they had to back up their data. It's not a matter of just turning on the accounts. It's what happened to all the data. That is the responsibility of you as a user or a company to back up your Exchange, your OneDrive, your SharePoint. Even scarier is, how about things like ransomware? If you have a user that lets ransomware into your SharePoint, all of a sudden, you got to pay a lot of money to unlock that. And these are very real threats. So we have a service. Once again, there's no software to install. It's for you to install. It's offered as a service that you can turn on and say, here's my 2,000 user accounts in Microsoft 365. I want them protected. And it will automatically back them up to the cloud of your choice. It's unlimited capacity, unlimited retention for like less than $4 per user per month. It takes care of all that. And if you have a scenario where somebody makes a mistake and blows away some accounts, or you have a disgruntled user who's leaving and thinks he's going to be cute and erase an entire SharePoint directory, both from the drive and the recycle bin, or if you have ransomware that gets entered and you say, oh, I need to go back to yesterday at 3 p.m., you can do that. Very simple, intuitive process. So those are the things that I recommend people pay attention to.
Excellent. So I kind of want to, so these are the things that we touched upon, right? And I think these are the takeaways from our conversation here today. Things to consider when building out VDI. Obviously, infrastructure we had talked about. The mobile aspect of moving VDI, either keeping it on-prem and partly out in cloud, depending on how mobile you need, and some of the services that NetApp provides there. The workload management we had talked about, where we're talking about automation for deployment management aspect of users and application and optimizations, which I kind of I forgot that piece that you were bringing along was the cost optimization, but as well as the resources to be able to support the desktops, right? And then ultimately backup and compliance, which should not be overlooked when it comes to any type of deployment,
Right.
which you had talked about. But no, I think with that, I think we're good to wrap it up. I appreciate everybody that joined. Chuck, always a pleasure to talk to you. You got a lot of great knowledge. I think we could have made this an hour. But for those of you listening that joined or are watching this, please contact Aspire. We can definitely help in this area. As I mentioned earlier, we partner with Cisco and NetApp as well to be able to help clients deploy these infrastructures. So yeah, you can reach us at datacenter@aspiretransforms.com. Chris, any other closing things that you'd like to take care of?
Yes, thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Christian. Before we go, we got a question from the audience, if you could address quickly. Okay. Can you use the solution with a government customer?
Yeah, so we actually talked about a number of solutions. We talked about, first of all, just generically VDI and WVD in Azure. And yes, you can use those. You would talk to your particular cloud environment or look at WVD in the GovCloud. Secondly, the storage layer, as Azure NetApp Files we talked about, absolutely, it does apply. VDS as a global control plane, it is in use in certain government agencies. So we can work through Aspire and say, what particular agency are you looking for? What qualifications and certs do we need? But again, it is in use. And finally, the backup and compliance are applicable in those environments. So I would say if you have a particular customer, because government's a pretty broad scope, and certain three-letter agencies may have different restrictions than some others, bring it to us, and we'll see which of these certifications. But we are in use in government certified clouds today.
Awesome.
Thank you. And with that, I would just remind everyone, please visit our website, www.aspiretransforms, to learn more about how Aspire, NetApp, and Cisco can help you deploy, manage, and optimize your VDI solution. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. We look forward to hearing from you, and have a good day.
Excellent.
Thanks, guys. Have a great weekend.
Have a great one. Thank you so much.